I'm George Siegel, and this is the Move the World podcast. Every week, we feature interviews with people dedicated to making the world a better place. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of the Move the World podcast. My guest today is Tom Little. Now, Tom is a certified floodplain manager and licensed insurance broker. He's the president of SmartVent Products Incorporated, Floodproofingcom, and Smart Product Innovations and Risk Reduction Plus Group. So, obviously, Tom is doing a lot of work in the world of flooding. Tom, thank you so much for being here this morning.
George, thanks for having me on. And that's certainly a mouthful, and you did great getting through it. So thank you.
Gosh, yeah, that could be my biggest challenge of the day. Now, first off, you were gracious enough to be in our documentary film, The Last House Standing, and provided some incredible information and valuable information that I think I talk about in every podcast that I've done. So hopefully you'll be sharing some more of that with us today. But if I came to you with all these things in your title and said, Tom, what do you do to move the world? What would you tell me?
Oh, well, it's an excellent question. And gosh, I think I would start with our team, not me specifically, maybe, but our organization and what we do as the family of companies that you reviewed through. We're focused on flood protection and flood insurance. But if I had to boil it all down, what I would say is we help families and business owners survive during a flood and after a flood. So everything that we do is about protecting buildings, infrastructure, whether it be residential or commercial structures, critical facilities. And our whole objective is the health, safety, and welfare of the occupants of those spaces. And so we're really looking out for those individuals and protecting them against the damaging effects of flood water.
Now, flooding is such a tragic thing. I don't think people realize the amount of damage that occurs from flooding. We see videos on the news where you see a house that looks like it was underwater, but then you don't see all the aftermath of the damage that water really does to that house. Give people an idea of how messed up a house is after getting water in it.
It's, I think the National Flood Insurance Program put out some data that 2 inches of flood water in the first level of a home can cause up to $20,000 of damage. And that's only a couple inches, right? And so when you look at a place like the city of Houston, and Hurricane Harvey hit the news a lot, right, when that was happening. And you had a lot of what we would call slab on grade homes. We see a lot of these in Florida as well, right, where it's a concrete slab right at the grade level. So when you flood, and like what they experienced in the city of Houston, you had 3-4 foot of flood water just come through the living floor of a home. And so I was down after Hurricane Harvey hit city of Houston, probably a week and a half after. And as you drove down the street, you literally saw just piles along the street and the curb line of all the contents that was in the house. I mean, total gut job up to 4 or 5 feet up in the air. And all of that debris, all that material was just piled up. It was piled up so high that in some cases you can't even see over the pile to see the home that all the material was removed from, right? That's the impact that this had as you're driving down the street. Inside the home, though, you'll hear the phrase after a flood, "Oh, we're mucking it out," right? And that just means you're basically just taking a shovel and you're just cleaning out debris and mud and everything that was in the flood water and outside that just traveled through the home. It changes you, right, when you see those things. That's a family.
Is the house ever the same after experiencing that? I mean, I know there's companies that come in and clean it and help disinfect and stuff, and then you do all the repairs. But is it ever really the same after that kind of damage?
Listen, you can remediate it, right? And like you spoke to, George, they'll come in and they'll clean it all out. They'll re-sheetrock, and they do a fantastic job where it's like, oh, wow, did this place ever flood? There are long-term effects that you have to be concerned with, moisture issues, mold, and so forth. That's all part of the remediation package, and they do a good job. But it's, and what we saw in the city of Houston, it's inevitable that's going to happen again, right? I mean, some of these properties I spoke to, Hurricane Harvey was the last storm that hit. Prior to that, they had 2 other events that hit. So some of these homes were severe repetitive loss homes, meaning that they've, experienced a flood and damage, in some cases 3 years in a row. So is the house ever the same? No, not really. It's not. And what happens is, even if you rebuild, and you can do that where it's like, you would never even know this house flooded. It's still vulnerable to flooding again, and that's where the flood protection element, comes into play.
Right. Now, when we talk about moving the world, obviously getting somebody's life back to normal is one step, but there's so many things people can do on the front side, either one, to minimize what that damage is like for them financially, or two, changes they could make to their house. In terms of financially, a lot of people don't read their insurance policies, and they may think that they are covered if their house floods, but that's not the case, is it?
That's exactly right. So part of our portfolio companies, we have a flood insurance agency. We sell flood insurance nationally, and you've probably you heard it in the Last House Standing as well, where the first line of defense for flood protection is your flood insurance policy, because your homeowners doesn't cover that particular risk, right? And so, as you mentioned, many, I would say majority of property owners, they're not aware of that, right? And so, flooding can happen anywhere, right? Our maps are constantly being updated. Hurricane Ida just rolled through the Gulf and up into the Northeast, and we experienced flash flooding situations in the Northeast, in areas that weren't mapped in a special flood hazard area and haven't flooded in hundreds of years. And it snuck up on everybody. And so it's Mother Nature reminding us that flooding can happen anywhere. If it can rain, it can flood, right? There's a million ways that we've probably heard, the push for flood insurance, but ultimately it's your first line of defense. And you want to have that policy in place to protect you, God forbid something does happen. And then the second layer would be mitigation.
Now, it's not as expensive. So, and that's the thing that's interesting to me is, like where I live in Tampa, if you have a house that's slab on grade, the flood elevation is actually 10 feet. So you go to buy flood insurance, if you're at sea level, you're paying a pretty penny for that. But if you're in an area that doesn't flood, it's really not that expensive to get it, is it?
No, and so FEMA will map you in a couple different zones, right? So we have what's called the special flood hazard areas, which are your higher risk. You'll hear A-type zones and V-type zones. V would be kind of like your homes right on the ocean front, typically built up on pilings. And the V, just think of greater velocity, V for velocity. A zones are a little bit inland from there. Then you have what they call the low to moderate risk zones. And those are the areas, George, that you're talking about where there is a risk of flooding. Like I mentioned, it can happen anywhere, but the risk is a little bit lower. And so when your risk is a little bit lower, you can purchase flood insurance at a very reasonable rate. Now, the NFIP is one avenue to purchase flood insurance, and they're in the midst of, actually, we're in October now. They just released the new methodology to rate a policy. It's called Risk Rating 2.0. So that's changing the dynamics a little bit with how they evaluate risk. And some areas premiums are going up higher than what we've experienced in the past, but it's supposed to be a good indication of the true risk. So the NFIP is one side of the flood insurance options, right? And that's the government's program. But then there's this whole other area that a property owner could look, and that's the private sector, private flood insurance policies. And these are through a lot of cases, these are like your surplus, Lloyd's of London back type of insurance policies. But it's another avenue to obtain flood insurance at a reasonable rate, as the government's program is evolving a little bit right now. So if you are, and it's all based off of risk, if you are in one of those lower risk areas, as you point out, you can get a flood insurance policy for, a few $100s a year to have that peace of mind. And one of the statistics that the NFIP puts out is the average claim, right, damage due to a flood is around that $50,000 to $60,000 mark. So you can get through the government's program, $250,000 in building coverage. So if you're in that low risk area and you're like, I just want to have a policy in place, at least get the policy and buy at least $60,000 worth of coverage.
Yeah. And then don't be those people that after you have a good year say, I don't need it next year, because then that's when you're going to need it. That's it. All disaster always finds us one way or the other.
100%.
Now, what's interesting to me when I see flood elevations in different parts of the country, a friend of mine lives in New Orleans and she showed me her flood elevation survey. And one part of the house was 3 feet under sea level, another was 4 feet under sea level. And I was looking at that going, wow, good luck getting flood insurance. They actually lowered her insurance because for that area, I guess that was considered pretty good. But that's below sea level. So that brings up my next question. Are we crazy where we choose to live? Because that's the whole premise of The Last House Standing. A good part of it is we blindly make choices without any real understanding of the risk. And then we're shocked when something bad happens. But we take a lot of risks in this country. I mean, we live in some pretty vulnerable places.
We do. But like you said, disaster will find you no matter, where you're at. Right. And so when you look at, and there's a lot of discussion within the flood industry where there's acquisitions that can take place, where grants are utilized to come right in and they'll purchase your home if you volunteer, right? Hey, I want to sell my home via this grant, and they'll make it green space. Okay. So they'll actually purchase the building. So this acquisition program's been around for a long amount of time, and it can be very effective in certain areas. But then you have these other areas that are economically established, right? And so there's a lot of history. Maybe when that particular property was built, now your New Orleans example is maybe not a good example for me with this point, but there's a lot of areas where at the time of construction, that home wasn't built in harm's way, but maybe development over the years in that concentrated area has changed the dynamics of the floodplain, right? Increased the flood depth heights. And so we do have a habit as a country. We like to build near bodies of water, whether it be riverine or the bubbling creek, in the backyard, and then obviously along our coastlines. It's beautiful. People love it. A lot of secondary homes in certain coastlines. So we do build there. We have a lot of infrastructure that was built years prior to maybe understanding risks. And then I guess the main thing is our building codes and standards that are in place today are strong enough to allow us to construct with, flood risk in mind and other risks for that matter, right? Last House Standing, we didn't just cover flood in that movie. You did a great job documenting many different perils in the space, fire and wind and so forth. Florida, for instance, you're worrying about when you construct a home, not just the flood risk, but hurricane exposure, wind ratings, and so forth, the impacts, right? So all of the standards in the building codes, and I think that was one takeaway from The Last House Standing is the codes and standards are way better today than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? And so those stronger codes, those stronger standards, the fact that disasters will find us anywhere, follow the codes, follow the standards, and you can build a resilient home.
Yeah, when you look at it, though, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting for me making this film is I've met a lot of people in the industry like you, and people that are contractors or people that are flood mitigation, just all different areas of disaster management. And you guys are doing a great job, and you all know about the job that you're doing. And then I approach it from my end, where I'm just a regular guy living in a neighborhood where I don't think anybody's prepared for anything. And I live in Tampa, and we're a bullseye for a major hurricane and damage. Last year, when I think it was Theta came through in November, it took the path that a deadly hurricane would take for this area. Fortunately, it was just a tropical storm, but a lot of houses flooded. I mean, there was a lot of damage here. And that should have woke people up to say, hey, we need to do something because the code's not strong enough. We don't have the right insurance. We're living in a house that's going to be a disaster. Mm-hmm. But I didn't really see much done. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
It's a great question. There's a lot of talk within studies, right? The National, the National Institute of Building Science, right? They put out a study, and I think it's for every dollar invested in mitigation in general, right, will save you $7 in disaster costs. a great statistic, right? And all the FEMA building science side of things, they talk about that. The folks behind all of the mitigation grant money that's behind it, that gets put out, they talk about that data and that statistic. But when it comes down to it, we aren't very proactive with that approach, much like you're saying, right? It's very reactive after the fact, after the storms come through. I think just in general, we need to be way more proactive with our pre-mitigation. And I don't think when we look at these grant programs, right, that exist, since 1989, less than 1% of the money available has been utilized on, we'll call them low-cost mitigation methods to make a structure more resilient. Less than 1% of all the money. It's a, and that's kind of disturbing with the technology that exists out there, right? That only less than 1% was utilized with wet floodproofing techniques, maybe retrofitting in flood vents into a foundation so it doesn't buckle under pressure of floodwater, dry floodproofing a commercial building, whatever it might be, maybe a critical facility, right? Less than 1% since 1989. But there's all this discussion that if we invest $1, we save $7, right? So there's a lot of talk, but to your point, not so much action. And it's like, okay, well, what happened to the other 99% of the money that's available? I think there's a lot of discussion on the bigger picture, right? We're looking at sea level rise, global warming, whatever you believe from a science standpoint. The fact of the matter is these storms are becoming more frequent. And when we're specifically talking about flooding, the depths are greater and the effects of it are way more widespread than what they were previously. Okay. And so I don't know what the answer is, but we got to take a more proactive approach to making our structures more resilient. And I'm a flood guy, right? So I'll speak to just the flood. There's solutions out there, but the messaging that maybe we're getting from the higher level, right, from the government, really isn't what's happening in the trenches. And I don't know the answer why, but we'll use this as a platform to maybe beat it up.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we talk about in the film is we're trying to wake people up from the bottom. Like, we need to demand more. We need to say, okay, how safe is that house? What are the flood risks? How was it built to withstand a disaster? But because the market has been so hot lately, real estate wise, people are afraid. It's like, well, if I start asking all these questions, they're just going to sell it to the next guy and then I'm not going to get it. My point is, don't reward somebody for building crap and pay too much for it. So now it's your problem, because eventually it's like musical chairs. Eventually the music's going to stop and you're going to be stuck with a house that nobody's going to want.
Absolutely.
And it just doesn't seem to change. And I think that's really frustrating. And I see that here because I have so many friends that I've met that don't have generators. They have wood houses primarily on the second floor. Their house is below a certain flood level. They have no idea what's in their insurance. I mean, you could go down the list of things and you go, okay, wrong. But nobody's beating them over the head with it. Tampa's probably great for disaster management of rescuing people and cleaning up after the storm and coming in and handling how people evacuate. But so much work has to be done before that, so we don't have to have the problem.
Right. Well, you bring up a really good point from a real estate transaction standpoint. I just want to speak briefly on what Realtor.com stepped up and did with the integration of First Street Foundation's flood factor, which is the first time ever in the real estate market that, flood disclosure was always kind of like, oh, we don't talk about that, right? We don't want to talk about flood zone and flood risk. But Realtor.com stepped up and they integrated in this flood factor. So when you are searching a home and you're like, that looks like a great property, I'm interested, I'm in Tampa, it tells you what your flood factor score is. That's your risk level. And it's a 1 out of 10 number. Now, if you're on the higher side, if you see a 7 or 8 out of 10, well, any regular, human, right, that's not a flood engineering expert will know, I don't think that's very good. A 7 or 8 or 9 or a 10 out of 10 is a high risk compared to what's the old messaging? Well, what's the flood map say? You're in and or out. No. So now they put a factor on it. And that was really big for the real estate market, for them to step up, realtor.com specifically. The others are following suit now, some of these other platforms. But now as a homeowner, right, that homeowner is now more educated to be able to say, let me ask some more questions about this property. It's a 7 out of 10. All right. Is there any mitigation built into the home? That's the flood risk. It's in a flood prone area and it's got a high risk. But are there steps I could do to mitigate it? Were there mitigation devices integrated into this home? I'll take it a step further. Where we need to go as an industry, our home inspectors that a buyer is hiring, right? They currently don't inspect for flood mitigation. They don't look at a foundation and go, that's an air vent, not an engineered flood vent, right? We need to get to a point where now our home inspectors are inspecting for flood risk measures and how that structure is built from a flood standpoint. The next thing, are mitigated homes, because there's a lot of properties out there that have made that investment in retrofitting in flood protection. Well, those homes need to appraise higher than a non-mitigated home next door, right? And that's another phase that I think we need to get to your point, George, of the consumer education. Now we're educating the consumer better with like these flood factors, but let's get the next set of professionals on board. And that's just going to drive that awareness. And it's also going to drive resiliency, because people are going to say, hey, I'm going to invest in mitigation and retrofit the home prior to a disaster. You know why? Because I'm going to get more money for the property. Just like if you upgrade the kitchen, right? We need to get to that point.
You know, I had a guy the other day come by who was trying to sell me solar panels. And I don't want to knock that industry, but I certainly can knock their sales approach, because he was saying to me, it's so valuable and you have a 25-year warranty and this is going to add value to your house. And I said, can you explain to me how it's going to add value to my house? And he goes, because the person buying it will want to save money on their electricity too. And I said, but that's baloney, because when I put a pool in, if I put $100,000 pool in, I've had realtors tell me you get maybe $20,000, $25,000 out of it. So if I sign a $50,000 contract with your solar power company and 5 years from now I go to sell my house, what is that worth? What is that worth to the next person? He could not answer that question. So when you're fixing up your house, if I have flood vents on my garage, if I have hurricane brackets on my walls, there should be a formula that makes that house more valuable so people understand it, because I don't think people know. I think people are buying solar panels left and right. It's like that's like the new timeshare to me in some ways. They're going to go 10 years from now, that company might not even be around. So what's a 25-year warranty even worth?
Right. And that's exactly the area that we need to focus in on next is, and our particular group, what we're working on is that exact appraisal approach. You know, we are trying to educate the Appraisal Institute to update the form, which would have a trickle down effect to the appraisers that are coming out, where they would have an area on that form to document those things that we just talked through, George. So now, and it's not easy. I mean, in 2011, the energy folks lobbied to push ahead. And when you have a more energy efficient home, there's now a section where you can get, call it credit, right? And build some more value. We want to get to the same point with the flood side. But you need to build a strong voice with different organizations. And so we're trying to pull in the realtor side of things, the real estate side. We're trying to pull in, like I mentioned, the home inspection group, all these different groups that have an interest in this, because it's the right thing to do. It's really, when you say things that are going to change the world, this is one avenue. This is one of those things that can, and listen, it's not grant money that we're talking about, right? If you can see a return on investment and you're going to create value in your, arguably your greatest asset that you own, right? Your home, people will make that investment into it, but we got to show them.
Absolutely. You have to show them. It would also be good probably to have commercials or marketing that shows the unseen cost of disaster, people losing their jobs, people losing their homes, people having crooks come up and charge them $10,000 to throw a tarp on their roof. I mean, all the things we saw from victims in the last house standing, were things that should show people you don't want to end up like this. I mean, it turns people's lives upside down for years when a disaster hits.
No, it does, and to me that speaks to the education side, right? And it's something that we do. Listen, within our portfolio companies, we have 40 employees, right? So, our focus on flood protection and flood insurance, we're providing for 40 families. We're super proud of that. One of the key things, though, that we do as an organization is that education, right? On all these different topics that we're discussing through. And so one example is we do this pre-storms and we do this post-storms, but we'll come in and we'll do a public outreach event and where we'll bring in residents into a community. And anybody that's maybe listening to us, if you're a community official, we do these, they're geared towards promoting flood insurance and mitigation methods that approaches that a resident can take. And to your point, we also teach them that, God forbid there is a storm, here's the steps you got to do, right, to protect yourself. Like you mentioned, the crooks, chucking a truck that's going to come and try to, put a tarp or a roof on your building. We heard so many scams right after the various storms in the Gulf. So it's all about the education side of things. These outreaches that I mentioned, we'll do them pre-storm events. And if a community is in what's called the community rating system or the CRS, which is a national flood insurance program, the community will actually get points for the outreach that will contribute towards discount for all of the residents that buy flood insurance through the government's program. So that it actually has a positive effect too on actual premiums.
Yeah, we saw firsthand in making our film, people that were getting ripped off by assigning benefits over to a contractor who ended up ripping them off. Yeah. And the other thing I've learned since then, I was a guest on a gentleman's podcast who's an attorney who goes after insurance companies because he was saying that a percentage of claims get rejected after a disaster. So you have to have the right insurance and you have to know what you have, because it's not a slam dunk. They're just going to hand you a check, right? You have to do something on your end to make it easier for them.
Right. You do. And yeah, you did a really good job of pointing that out in the Last House Standing. And one example, when Hurricane Sandy hit the Northeast, we elevated tens of thousands of homes in New Jersey and New York with disaster recovery money, right? And there was these state grants that were established. We were elevating existing homes. A lot of people, maybe listeners, don't even know that. I mean, we can take that slab on grade house that I talked about in Houston, and guess what? We can drive steel beams underneath that and jacks and actually lift the house up above the floodplain level, right? It's great technology. It's been around for hundreds of years. Well, speaking to making sure you're using credible contractors, licensed and insured contractors, right? Ethical contractors, the list goes on. When Sandy hit, there was a lot of people that were just got in line because there's so much money floating out. Oh, guess what? I can lift houses. And there was instances where they dropped homes, right? So they're lifting the home up and they dropped it, right? So it's really important. Now there's since been measures put in place to, check the credibility of these when it comes to the house lifting industry. But it's super important to make sure that you're checking those credentials to not get scammed.
Yeah. Now it's interesting too. After making the film and I saw the flood vents that you put on houses, I now see them popping up in my neighborhood when I'm walking around. And you see some builders that just put the screen on the garage, which you say is a mistake. I mean, if people have that, there's certain things you should go out and look at your house right away, right? That's not a good formula for having your house survive if you just have a screen on the vent in your garage.
Right. So when we look at flood vents are part of a method called wet flood proofing, right? And so it kind of tricks the everyday person's mind where they're like, why would I wet flood proofing? That means things get wet. Why would you want to let the flood water in, right? So we'll start there. So flood vents, what they do is they open up to relieve the pressure. They call it hydrostatic pressure, right? Flood water pressure, hydrostatic pressure. it relieves the pressure off the wall so it doesn't collapse. Like you speak to the garage, it would save, the flood vents would save that garage door. It's going to save the foundation walls. In an elevated structure, whether it's on a crawl space or say a full height enclosure, something that you can walk into, if you get 2, 3, 4 foot of pressure on that wall, that pressure can collapse the foundation, right? So your first floor might be nice, high and dry above the floodplain mark, right? Floodwater will never reach that level. But if your foundation isn't protected, it could come collapsing down, and who cares how high your first living floor was at that point. So to your point, in our particular case, we manufacture 2 engineered flood vents, Smart Vent, and then another one called Freedom Flood Vent, all built in the United States, which we're very proud of, but they flip open. So debris is going to be able to pass through whatever's in the floodwater, right? There's always stuff in there. Debris is a fact of flood. So it allows it to pass through compared to, say, an air vent, like you mentioned, right? Maybe it's a screened over opening. It's got maybe grills and different louvers in the way. That all impedes the flow and will trap the debris. And ultimately that pressure can build up and cause structural damage to the home.
Now, when you try to show builders why they should be using this stuff, do you run into obstacles from them? I mean, I'm a believer that there's a lot of builders that are great, but they're also in a business to make money. So they're looking at ways they can save money off of the cost of that house, not necessarily adding value. What response do you get when you show them that this could make a difference between saving a house or not saving a house?
Well, it's their name on the line. One, I mean, that's part of our discussion. What we do a lot of, George, we'll work with the design community, the architects, the engineers that are designing a home, say, to the current building codes and standards, right? And so when you really narrow it down, an architect looks at it and goes, no way would I ever use an air vent as a flood vent because it's not designed specifically for that application. So they'll end up specifying an engineered flood vent. At that point, it's gone through the permitting process through the building department. What's on the plans needs to be used in the foundation. So the builder should be utilizing what's specified by the design professional that sealed it. That's an area that when we talk about homeowner education, right? If you're building a new home, look at what the architect specified on those plans and make sure, hold your builder accountable that they're utilizing those, right? Because like you mentioned, they're going to try to optimize profitability, and maybe they're not educated enough on the flood vents and they think, oh, I can just use a regular air vent and that's going to suffice. No, make sure you hold them accountable for that. So it's specifications key. Architects get that. But when it comes to a builder and the messaging, the other item that we typically hit on is there is a cost benefit. And many of the builders maybe don't see this, but when you speak to an air vent, and we've been doing this for 20 years, educating people on engineered flood vents versus an air vent, which, by the way, FEMA calls a non-engineered opening. Non-engineered meaning it's not designed as a flood opening, right? So one of say a smart vent covers 200 square feet of enclosed area, where that air vent, which is going to cloud with debris, and you shouldn't use it per the standards, but if it was used, that's only going to cover maybe 30 square inches of net free area. So now, just for the sake of easy numbers, you might need to use 5, 6 more of those air vents. That's a lot more holes around your foundation to try to get the necessary relief that you need to prevent that foundation from having structural damage. So that's a big part of the messaging. And then flood insurance cost. Okay. So with whether you're with the NFIP or the private sector, they recognize compliant flood vents for a mitigation credit. So you would get a discount there. That's a selling feature for a builder, just like the granite is, right? In that beautiful kitchen. Yeah. Speak to, hey, this foundation is protected with state-of-the-art flood protection. And oh, by the way, it's reducing your flood insurance premium on the home. What a great selling feature. I mean, that's where the builders need to go with it, right? Is build it as part of the value package, much like they would do with any of the finishes. So that's a little bit of what we educate them on.
Yeah, I think people, when they're looking at a house, should really look and think forward. I could walk through every house I've ever owned and show you where the builder saved a nickel and where it ended up costing me money later. because
Right.
nobody held them to a higher standard. So I think we have to demand more. And it certainly sounds like you provide the kind of tools that would make it easier. What we learned in Oklahoma, if they hadn't actually changed the building code, people would still choose to have granite countertops over a safer house. So I don't think people just, we want the eye candy, but we don't understand that that's not going to save us in the end.
That's right. I mean, City of Houston was very proactive after Harvey. It's almost like they cried uncle and they updated their floodplain management ordinance. They did something that has never been seen in the US. They updated their floodplain management ordinance and they now regulate the shaded X zone, right? So outside the special flood hazard area or high risk zones, they said, well, 80% of our losses, flood damage, came from these areas that were outside the high risk. So what did that tell them? Oh, our maps are wrong, right? So they updated, to your point, the demand, the experience. They were they were finally proactive after the Harvey storm, right? And they updated an old, outdated ordinance to say, we know the maps are off. We know where the flooding hit. We're now going to enforce our codes and standards and inspect for flood compliance in these other areas. And that's a good move in the right direction. I can't speak any highlier of the International Code Council. They're the ones that put out the International Residential Code, the International Building Code. They do extensive training with their building officials, construction officials, and inspectors. And that's a group that has been very proactive and pro the takeaways and the mission that I think that the Last House Standing spoke to, right? Is that we can do better. There's ways to do better. Enforcement is a key component of that too.
Yeah, definitely. And we want to applaud people that are doing the right things and probably do more calling out for people that aren't. But, the message has to make it down to the masses, right? That these things are available so we can take advantage of them. Now, if you had to give advice, okay, somebody's looking at a house, what's the number one thing you would tell them? So we're going to move the world in advance here to try to save them. What should they be looking at when they look at a house?
So I'll speak to flood, right? Because that's my expertise. The number one item they should request is have a zone determination done on it, a flood zone determination. Any insurance agent can do that for you. You can also go to the local municipality. They'll pull up the floodplain maps and you can look. You can look on your own at the FEMA Map Center. They've made it very user-friendly now where you can type in the address, pull up the maps. Identify, is it currently mapped in a special flood hazard area? If it is, okay, it's in one of those A or B zones. As a buyer, ask for the elevation certificate. An elevation certificate would be done by a professional land surveyor. And it's a document. I actually might have one lying around here. Yeah, here we go. It's a document that's going to look like something like this. Now, for our listeners, it's a form with the actual elevations of the property. And that's kind of, you can look at our particular team of certified floodplain managers. We can look at an elevation certificate without any pictures of the home. And we can draw out how that house sits compared to the base flood elevation, which is the calculated height that flood would rise in that area, right? So we can look at that. We can look at where the first living floor is. Where's the lowest floor? What are the grade levels at? So that's one step. Ask for that elevation certificate. Work with a professional group to say, hey, is my first living floor above the floodplain mark, right? And you mentioned the home in New Orleans that's maybe 2, 3, 4 feet below sea level, right? That elevation certificate would spell that out for you. Now, maybe in New Orleans, in some of those areas, it's just fact, right? Everybody knows it. But the elevation certificate is a key document you want to ask for. And then also, if it's on a raised foundation, we talked all about compliant flood vents and why they're important. Ask your home inspector, look at the foundation. Is it an air vent or is it an engineered flood vent? Something that's going to mechanically move. Because you want to make sure that foundation is nice and sound. Even though it's elevated, maybe high enough, you want to make sure you have a protected foundation.
Yeah, and as we learned, walk around the neighborhood and talk to people in the neighborhood and find out what happens there when it rains. We were looking at a house. A guy was walking by, and I said, "What's the water like here when it rains?" And he goes, "It goes all the way up to the front door every time it rains." We left there like that. It's like, okay, we're out of here.
Couldn't get out of that area quick enough. Yeah.
Yeah. So you definitely have to do your homework. And now, if you had to give somebody advice for, they have an idea or a thought that they think could be something that could help other people or benefit other people, as a guy who seems to have a lot of innovations, what would you tell somebody who's trying to make a difference in the world? What should they do to get in the game?
To get in the game, I mean, it's good. I'll just say this, right? I have hanging on my wall, I'm looking over here, a Walt Disney quote, right? And the way to get started is the quit talking and begin doing, right? I just feel like in the world in general, we do a lot of talking, and it's a lot of high level talking. And I read a book years ago, it was called Think Big, but Act Small, right? So I guess I'd morph the two concepts together, right? Enough with the talking, start doing, and guess what? You don't have to do the biggest thing or whatever you're behind, right? Take some small steps, right? Get some momentum building, but do something with it. Because there's only so many newspaper articles that we can talk about the same dang thing over and over again, or the same messaging in a talk. There's got to be more doers out there, right? And even if that's just taking small little steps, start to chip away with whatever your mission is, but start being active with your thoughts. If you believe and are passionate about it that much, you got to start doing something with it, talking to different people, collecting other voices that have the same thought process and same, passion behind whatever the messaging is. So that would be my advice.
That's great. That's great advice. Now, if I'm going to put it in the notes for the show, but if somebody wants to get a hold of you, get in touch to talk about flooding and all the different things that you guys do, what's the best way for somebody to reach out to you?
So we have probably the best website that you can go to when it comes to everything that we kind of talked about, flood protection, flood insurance. You go to floodproofing.com, right? And that's a great resource that will kind of go through all of those, the different products that are available for dry flood proofing, keeping the water out, wet flood proofing, such as flood vents, and then information on the flood insurance side. We have a live chat button. You can actually live chat with a certified floodplain manager Monday through Friday. info@floodproofing.com if you like to send emails. And then if you want to just pick up the phone, you will get a human being. This is a miracle, George. You will get a human being within 2 rings when you call 877-441-8368.
That is awesome. Hey, Tom, thank you so much for coming on today, for giving your time and all that you gave to the last house standing, because through meeting floodplain managers, and those people have been terrific supporters of the film in terms of getting it in front of them and having them see it. So it is much appreciated.
Well, you did a fantastic job with the film, and it's such a good educational tool. And for any of the listeners that haven't checked it out, please be sure to do so. It's very impactful. So you did an excellent job, and thank you for having us included in that.
All right. Thank you for the part that you played in making the film. So that's going to do it for this episode of the Move the World podcast. As Tom was saying, that's motivation there. If you have an idea, if there's something you think you can do that's going to make a difference in the world, don't just talk about it. Start doing it. We'll see you next time.